Clare Membriela, is a library law consultant. Yay!
Hi. So, as Shannon mentioned, this is the first time we've been out in like presenting public since the pandemic. So that's very exciting. It's the first time I've had real shoes on my feet in 18 months. Yeah, so hey, that's a plus. Today's a good day, and someday I'll be able to wear lipstick again. So things are looking up. Okay, and it's so nice to see everybody. It's so nice to see groups where it's not like all squished in a screen and I don't have to squint to see everybody. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to briefly kind of go through some things that are happening, kind of what the hot things that I'm working on right now that I'm getting a lot of questions on. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the budget that Shannon mentioned that is just about all the way through the legislature. So the budget is at the point where pretty much everybody's agreed on it. They're still waiting for like a rubber stamp from the House, and then it's got to go to the governor for signature. But there's lots of documentation and the full text of the bill online if you want to take a look at it. And everything is under the Department of Education for the most part that libraries will be concerned about. Now, a lot of times in legislatures, when you're dealing with appropriation bills like this, big bills where there has to be a lot of consensus and discussion, people tend to slip little things in, right? So like, pork projects, but things tend to be kind of slipped in that maybe have nothing to do with the budget. And this happens at the federal level too. Some really famous parts of legislation started out as part of an appropriations bill. So one of the things that got slipped in there in the Department of Education section is the legislature has put in a line that says that essentially it says that there cannot be vaccine mandates for public employees. So that's kind of a response to the Biden. You may have heard about, President Biden outlined his COVID plan, and one of the things was a mandate for private employers. Now, those rules are being promulgated by OSHA, okay? OSHA, the federal OSHA covers, many states, but it doesn't necessarily specifically directly cover Michigan because Michigan is one of the states that has its own, what they call a plan, right? So they have their own worker safe and health plan that they submitted to the federal government and got approved by OSHA way back when. And that was where MyOSHA came from. But because as a state plan, MyOSHA has to follow OSHA. So they cannot do anything like more free or less restrictive than what OSHA puts out. So that means that when the OSHA rules come out, MyOSHA would have to adopt them. Because MyOSHA is a state plan, okay, and we're not one of the states that strictly abides by OSHA, MyOSHA covers public and private employers. In OSHA only covers private employers, okay? So many states that don't have their own state plan have separate laws to cover public employees and workplace safety. Michigan has it all combined because of that state plan. So what that means is that if OSHA when they come out with the rule that Biden has instructed them to put out, and when MyOSHA adopted it, it would have to apply to public and private employees. So that would be the reason why the legislature would have stuck this in. So assuming that this all goes through and that the governor signs it, depending on what that language that OSHA puts out says, and depending on what MyOSHA does, it would seem that public employees would not be able to be bound by a vaccine mandate. But I have to stress that because we don't have any official language for any of these yet, we don't really know how things are going to look. But I wanted just to put that on your plate because chances are you're going to hear about it in the news. And so I wanted just to kind of give you a brief background so you kind of understood the relationships between this private employer mandate and the public employer. but I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about it. Okay, also, we're going to talk about some more COVID stuff, and I'm going to be pretty brief about this. The biggest questions I'm getting have to do with policies, so library COVID policies right now, and employment issues with COVID policies. So, about regular COVID policies, the best advice I can give you is to look at the CDC guidelines and read them very, very carefully, okay? Because there's some weird stuff in there. You know, for example, if you are vaccinated and you were exposed to someone with COVID, you do not have to quarantine, okay? You have to wear a mask inside and monitor symptoms for 14 days. If you're unvaccinated, you have to quarantine. So as you're developing these policies, it's important that you read these, because all of the substantive law on this refers to current CDC guidance. The other thing you need to know about is the COVID-19 Employment Rights Act, which is a Michigan law that was passed last year that essentially says that no employer can retaliate, can discipline, can discharge an employee for having COVID, for quarantining because of COVID. It also states that an employer may not permit an employee that's been is exposed to COVID or has COVID symptoms or is diagnosed with COVID, they cannot permit them in the workspace. But it says in accordance with CDC guidance. So that means if you have a vaccinated employee who was exposed, they don't have to quarantine. They can come to work, but they must wear a mask and monitor for symptoms. If they get symptoms, then they have to quarantine or isolate. So those are the kind of nuances. You know, it's not all black and white, so it's important to understand that. There's been some conflict in workplaces because many places have vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. And there's everything from those two groups of employees going at each other to unvaccinated employees are out a lot because of quarantining or get to work from home because of quarantining, and vaccinated employees who are in the office having to cover for those that are out, and there's some conflict there. So again, the best advice I can give you from what I'm seeing from, because this is happening all over the country, right? So employment lawyers all over the country, there's lots of discussions on this. Also, HR sites and HR people are talking about this. And really, a lot of it boils down to how far you're willing to go to enforce your policy or enforce, the culture of your workplace. So are you prepared to fire that employee who you really like, who's very good, because they're not wearing the mask like they're supposed to? And that's really a decision that is it something you and your board have to decide, right? Are you going to permit remote work for one person who's unvaccinated, but not for another who's vaccinated? That's something else you have to decide. The one guidance that I can give you is you want to be really, when you have a policy like mask wearing, whatever you do for one, you're going to have to be prepared to do it for everybody. So you can't say, well, we're not really enforcing the mask policy with Barb because, she's Barb. We all know Barb. Barb is Barb. You can't do that and then enforce it for another employee. That creates a whole other level of problem that you don't want to get into. So the best advice is when you make policies, make them as consistent as you can. If you want to have a mask, if you want your unvaccinated people to wear masks, the best advice I can give you is have your vaccinated people wear masks too. CDC guidance says if you're in an area of high transmission or thank you, that's the word I couldn't get. I was going to say even higher. They say you should wear a mask inside anyway. So you have a basis to do it, right? If you're in an area with a lot of conflict and no one wants to wear a mask, again, station people 6 feet apart, right? So if you have 2 people at CERC, maybe look at renegotiating that. There are some other creative things you can do within the CDC guidance. Masks right now, according to the science, is the safest thing you can do, right? If you have a situation where you have employees that are out a lot because of this, and you can't just fire them, even if their social media page says, we're going to the nightclubs and we're not wearing masks and I don't care because I think it's a hoax or whatever, you still can't retaliate against them, even if they're acting irresponsibly off the job because of this law. So what you're going to want to do is, one thing you could consider is go ahead and have them quarantine, blah, 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 or work from home. But you may want to take a look at your vaccinated staff in the office and see what their stress level is. And if you have people who, you're asking them to change their schedules to cover deaths, well, maybe look at your hours. Maybe you shorten your hours a little bit for a brief amount of time. Maybe, you go back to curbside for a brief amount of time if your staffing is really cut low because you have a lot of staff on quarantine. So just little things like that to show your vaccinated staff, hey, I understand, and we're all kind of up to here with this, and we're all stressed, and we know that that's a problem, but this is the best we can do. So those are just some creative problem solving. I'll just double check, make sure I covered everything there. Have your staff take conflict management training. The courses that Shannon mentioned in Niche, there are some very good ones, and Web Junction. How many of you here have used Web Junction? Yeah, those of you who haven't, take a look, because I went on and there was a ton of things that I wanted to take. I show them to boards. There are a lot of really good things there. So they have some really good difficult conversation and conflict management courses, and that can help employees deal with each other, right? As well as deal with difficult patrons. Okay, establishment. And if you have a specific problem COVID-wise, because everybody's a little different, don't hesitate, you can give me a buzz, or your attorney. So establishment, I'm starting to have a lot of questions on establishment. And as we've said, everybody should know what their establishment is. And beyond just, I'm a city library, or I'm a township library, you should know the statute that you've been founded under. So if you're not sure, you can call us. We have records. We may not have all the records for your library, but we'll see what we have, and we'll see if we can ferret it out. I'm in the middle of creating a list of every library in the state and what their official establishment is. And so, I'm just about done with the city libraries, which are the hardest group. And then, so the rest of it should hopefully go pretty quickly. So that will be placed on the web once we're done. Currently on the web is a chart of establishment types that are currently active in Michigan and what you should have if you are that type. So for example, if you are a district library, it tells you how many board members you should have or what the options for board members are, whether your board should be appointed or elected. And it gives you kind of the requirements. So if you're a city PA 164 Section 1 library, you should have a 5, 7, or 9 appointed board. So you should have either a resolution or a city code or a city charter section about the library. So there's different things. So take a look at that chart, because if you aren't sure what you are, that chart can help you figure it out based on your characteristics of your governance in many instances. We have a lot of municipal overreach. So a lot of municipalities who think they're in charge of the library, but when you look at the library's establishment, they're not. I'm finding more and more governing boards that are being treated like advisory boards, and even the board doesn't realize they're supposed to be governing because the municipality pretty much is running over them. So it's important to double check things like that, right? So to make sure that your library is operating in the way that it was meant to operate. And you may find that once it does, you're going to have a lot more control and a lot more options as a director. Incorrect number of board members. There's a lot of boards out there. There's one board in the state that has like 16 board members. Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, what? So sometimes they've just been you know, it's just happened kind of organically. You know, the library got started, it was maybe a township library, and then just, you know, someone thought, well, you know what, we shouldn't have an even number of libraries, of board members, we really should have an odd number, and then it just kind of built from there. Or they got contracts and added board members on because of the contracts, which is something else that's not quite kosher. So, for certain libraries. So, you know, so those kinds of questions are the things that, you know, could come up. So that's one of the reasons why it's very important to know your establishment. The main reason is your establishment sets what your board's powers are, what your rights are versus your municipalities, how much control you have over your money, whether you can have your own credit card. So there's different important things that lead from what your establishment is. And so that's one of the things, whether or not you can go for your own millage. So that's one of the important things of why it's a really good idea to check to see what your establishment is. And again, if you have a question, we can help you with that. Lastly, board conflicts. Now this, one of the main things that's happening here is, you know, because of what's going on in the country and politics and how contentious things are, there are some very extremist political groups that are starting to gain footholds in local politics, and that's kind of like strategy from their national group. And it's both sides of the aisle, and they will, you know, their idea is that they want to get on school boards, library boards, and then they want to operate according to their own political agenda, which we tell board members, look, when you're on a library board, your responsibility is the library. Your focus should be the library. It's like your children. Everything's in the best interest of the library. I don't care what your politics are. You're not here to put forth your political agenda. You're here to help the library. So what's happening is these boards, these people are getting on these boards and they're splitting boards because of radical agendas. So there's several libraries in the state right now that are having some very big problems internally because of this kind of thing. So what can you do about this? Well, your best option is to understand how your board is seated. So if your board is appointed, how does that process work? Who does the appointing? How does that work? If your municipality should do the appointing, usually it's a municipality that would have to appoint. How does that work? You know, do they just take anybody who walks in the door? Is there an application process? And then you yourself keep an eye out for, you know, people who would make good board members. Do you have a patron in the library who's one of the patrons, a regular patron, who you feel is vested in the library, who you think would make a great board member? Talk to them and then, you know, kind of push them towards the process. When you know you have a board opening, advertise it so that it's not, you know, it's not just a very small group of people who are keeping their eye open for these kinds of openings, that you get a chance to have more diversity on your board, and kind of head off some of these, you know, these problems. The other thing is that remind your board, make sure your board gets trained. Make sure your board gets regularly trained, right? Make sure your board is offered training from multiple sources. Because I train, but no one wants to just only listen to me. You know, yeah, I know I'm great, but it works. The best thing is when you have different authorities saying the same thing, right? So that's why when I go somewhere and Ann Suring says something that I say, I'm like, yes, because it's good to hear things from other mouths, right? So your board's the same way, right? Get them into Web Junction training, get them United for Library training, invite your co-op director to train. You can ask me to train. You know, training doesn't have to be long. It can just be one topic for, you know, 25 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long training. And one important thing is to understand, is to have them understand that they're empowered, right? So if you have a 6-member board, you know, and you have a couple of troublemakers on the board, there's 4 other people on that board who can shut those 2 down. But a lot of board members don't want to because they're like, we don't want to create conflict. We're just going to sit back and let it happen. And if it gets too bad, I'll just quit. You know, and I try to talk board members out of that. No. The 4 of you can impose your will, right? So that you have options, strategies that you can employ if you find that your board is going off the rails. And one of the best things I can recommend is get help. So call your co-op director. You can contact us. You can call Shannon. You can call me. so that at least, you can get those options right up front as to what can I do and what are the options open to us. Because board issues are starting to be a very, very big problem. They've always been an issue, but I'm finding bigger ones and more of them. So that is the other issue. Foster municipal relationships. If you haven't already, get to know your municipality, especially if you're a municipal library, not a district library. Although if you're a district, it wouldn't help with that either. But if you're a municipal library, make sure you get to know people in your municipality, just on a casual collegial basis. Once in a while, have a cup of coffee with your city manager or your township supervisor. Just get to know them, so that way when you do have a problem, like with a board member, or you do want a certain person appointed, you can have a talk about that, right? So the idea is that the more colleagues you have and the more support you have, the easier it can be for you when there's a problem. And the more people you have to reach out to. So if you get stuck with a really big board problem, or maybe a board that is doing things that you think are completely wrong, you can reach out to your municipality. Even if you have an elected board, you can still reach out to your municipality and say, help, this is happening. Do you have any suggestions for me, or what can we do? So that is pretty much what I had for my main big things that are happening. We wanted to make sure we left room for questions. So who